Every year, hundreds of people endure a long journey on trains, buses, cars, boats, and more boats to visit a tiny, roughly 1.5 by 3.5 mile long island off the southwest coast of Scotland, known as the Isle of Iona. At first glance, it's hard to tell what the big deal is about this tiny little island. Sure, it's a quiet place where you can get away from the sounds of civilization. Only about 100 people or so live on the island given its remote location. And while it is a beautiful place with green grass, old stone buildings, and a landscape dotted with sheep that far outnumber the people, it's also a place where the rain and wind off the North Sea can drive right through you no matter how great your rain gear is. So why then do so many spend countless hours just trying to get there to visit it? There's something mystical and otherworldly about this place. Back in the 6th century, St. Columba arrived there after fleeing his native Ireland and established a monastic community there. And a 12th century stone abbey still stands to this day as a beacon on the eastern shore to all who would come to visit. When the monks set up their life there, many visitors came seeking something to fill their longing souls. It was the Celts who first came to believe that this small, idyllic island is what is known as a thin place. Many today tend to have this picture of heaven as this far-off place we one day just hope to see. It is a place too removed from earth to have any real interaction with. But the Celts may have been onto something with their idea of a thin place, which is a spot where they believed the distance between heaven and earth was incredibly small. Some articles I read even suggest that they measured it to the exact distance of 3 feet. A 20th century monk by the name of Thomas Merton once wrote this about thin places, thinking that they might be even more prevalent than the Celts even seemed to believe. Life is simple, he wrote. We are living in a world that is absolutely transparent, and God is shining through it all the time. If we abandon ourselves to God and forgot ourselves, we see it sometimes. The only thing is that we don't let ourselves see it. Merton's words invite us to reflect not just on Micah's words that we read today, but all the prophecies which foretold the coming of Christ and who he would be. It's easy at Christmas time to be so wrapped up that we miss the essence of it all. Even in the Advent story of Christ's birth, we like to focus on the myriad of players involved to the point that we forget that the place where heaven and earth didn't just have a thin distance between them, but actually merged together was in the newborn baby, Jesus the Christ. Heaven and earth don't just touch fingertips. They merged into one in the fullness in the Messiah. Now, the prophet Micah, considered by many to be the angriest prophet, called for his listeners to focus on finding those kinds of thin places in the midst of a very thick and foreboding cloud of evil and destruction all around them. Much of Micah's prophesying called out the same sorts of things that all the other prophets tended to focus in on that was wrong throughout the centuries. Evil kings and rulers, selfish, wealthy business people, unscrupulous bankers and moneylenders, unfaithful religious leaders, and many other sinful people who mocked and dishonored Yahweh in a variety of ways. He ferociously tears at all these evils with a hatred only matched by the Lord himself. Now, it's important to know that Micah's words of promise come in the midst of that kind of suffering, tribulation, and rampant evil. But we cannot separate the good from the bad. It is because of all the brokenness of the world that God promises hope in the Messiah. It is the messiness of it all that God promises to clean up one day. It is why Paul reminds us to rejoice in suffering. Not that we wish for ill to happen upon ourselves or anyone, but that God can work through it. As the famous TV sitcom reminds us, you take the good, you take the bad, and there you have the facts of life. I knew somebody had to know it. We'll see how second service does with that. All of the prophets we have heard from this Advent season, and even the ones we did not look at, speak to the poor state of God's creation. So many of them point out our human tendency to stray far from God's intent for our own gain and selfishness. It started in the garden, and it has continued until this very day. Micah specifically wants us to know that in a world of all that sin, a world of chaos and violence of many different kinds, the Messiah is one of peace. The Christ will establish a rule that will stand as a shepherd with God's strength guiding him. Now, it's easy for us to think of King David at some level with this kind of imagery. The shepherd boy turned king, ruling with God's heart in his mind. And for some Hebrew people hearing Micah's words, that's probably the image they conjured up at the same time as well. But Micah's promise is more than that. David was good. The ruler coming will be better. He will be absolutely the best. David had long since passed away by the time Micah showed up, and sure, that made him pretty old. But the coming king would be even older than time itself. Now, peace. It's a word we frequently use and speak to one another, isn't it? But it's a word we may not fully grasp the meaning of in light of the language translation. Just like the word that Hebrew has for love in the Bible, peace itself has a much richer, deeper meaning to it in the Hebrew sense. The word used in Micah and in many other places that we translate as peace is the word shalom. Now, Chris C., an author of the book The Gospel According to Jesus, says this about that. Shalom, a word sometimes used as a greeting or parting that means peace, although its depth is greater than peace. It is more a picture of wholeness. It means beauty. For Chris, shalom is viewed in light of an understanding that true righteousness in our lives means God's restorative justice. God desires all of us to be restored to him. Shalom, that wholeness of all that we are, comes through Christ. Shalom is a word that describes the world as it will someday be. Christine Sign helps us put that in perspective and understands it this way. Essentially, the fall from the garden unleashed the forces of anti-shalom, ripping apart the harmony and mutual love of God's original creation. It broke God's shalom relationships and fractured the spirit of togetherness that bound us to God, to each other, and to God's creation. For Jesus and his ministry, as he grew, it was all about finding people who did not know shalom and drawing them to him in order so that they might experience it. According to Chris again, our King did not enter into this fallen world to be a bystander amid brokenness. Just the opposite. He was drawn to it. As you read the Gospels, you would think Jesus aimed his path with GPS precision to the places where brokenness, disease, sickness, and depravity abounded most. In a cesspool of sickness and disease that all people would rightly avoid, Jesus walks right in and touches the suffering. Chris also shares this amazing story from his childhood where he retells how his father did not see people as good or bad, but rather as people who simply did not know shalom. Check this out. Chris says this: growing up, we didn't have a lot of money. So we used to get outfield deck seats, aka the cheap seats, to see baseball games at the Astrodome. Most of the people buying the cheap seats did so to save money for beer. After the first few innings, they were drunk. And by the time the 7th inning stretch rolled around, there would be beer mixed with peanut shells on the floor, spilled beer down your back, and a brawl 2 rows over and back to the left. It was ugly out there. As a kid, I learned from other people that we were sitting with the, quote, bad people. By the time we noticed someone drinking his second beer, we'd start pulling away from him. Now, there was one consistent drunk fan named Batty Bob. He was a self-proclaimed Houston Astros mascot. He'd come to all the games wearing a rainbow wig, and he'd lead slurred cheers in the stands. I remember one time my dad went out to sit and talk with Batty Bob. He spent that whole game with Bob, then walked him out to the parking lot to bring him home with us. I was more than confused because this guy was one of the bad people. When we got home, my dad came to me and explained how God loved Batty Bob. I remember thinking, really? Batty Bob? But he stayed with us for a few days to get back on his feet. This is when I started to realize that God did not despise these people. He dearly loved them. Now, despite all its merit, the Greek worldview from which many of us come from has created a treacherous ground for Christianity. What the Hebrew viewed holistically and wrote about holistically in the Bible, the Greek divided and dichotomized. For us modern Christians, we have taken a previously integrated world and subdivided it into sacred and secular, physical and spiritual, good or bad, profane or religious. And if it doesn't fit into the sacred, spiritual, good, religious category, then we must do all we can to prevent it, avoid it, and make sure that it never comes close to even touching us. But Jesus didn't quite really see it that way. Yes, there are certain things we definitely need to avoid that could trip us up and lead us into sin. I fully admit that. But people need to know the love of Christ. And Jesus himself showed us how to do it. He wants us to step in the mud and get a little dirty. Shalom comes to people by the way we show them that they have value both to us and to God. Imagine how the world will be changed by the power of the gospel if we stopped seeing people as simply good or bad. Imagine how the love of God might be manifest if we started seeing people as simply being in the midst of broken shalom and recognizing God's call to all of us to join in his redemptive work. What a privilege! The arrival of Christ demonstrates for us the danger of shutting out the ills of the world. Jesus didn't shy away from the dirtiness of suffering and brokenness. He often made a beeline for it. He knew just where to find it, and he relished the opportunity to make shalom happen. He also challenged the religious leaders because they were insulating themselves from it. The prophets before Christ and the church leaders after Christ all charge God's faithful people to not take a see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil approach to all the world's sin sickness. He wants us to be a part of the missionary nursing team, bringing the cure of Jesus Christ in mighty and tangible ways to all those in the world. In one of her most memorable sermons, Barbara Brown Taylor begins talking about a ruined church she once saw in old Ephesus when she took a tour of Turkey and Asia Minor. Most of the church was gone, save for part of a mosaic that had once been the backdrop of the chancel area. Now, the mosaic was that of Christ the Lord looking out over the church with his hand raised in blessing. But the ruined church, only half of the face remained. And only part of that hand raised in blessing was gone too. This became a metaphor for Taylor of Jesus' constant blessing of and his constant gaze out over what is often as not a church in ruins and lives in ruins within that church too. But I think it's her closing illustration of that sermon that best captures this understanding of how Christ entered into a broken world with hope and peace. Taylor tells us of a woman still recovering from a very intensive round of chemotherapy to treat a very aggressive form of cancer, who did one of the scripture readings at a Christmas Eve candlelight service. The woman lugged a small oxygen tank with her to the lectern. And as she read the words of gospel hope, the tank hissed rhythmically. And there was just something of that mixture of brokenness and hope, of the ruination of cancer and the word of life that is the message of Christ's incarnation that summed up the hope we hold to as Christian believers. We cannot shut the ruins of life out of the church. Indeed, we must not. For into that situation, Christ himself came down here once upon a time to shore up flagging spirits, to lift up drooping hands, to stabilize wobbly knees, and to declare a promise that, as Micah reminds us, really does extend to the ends of the earth. Behold, I am making all things new. Amen.